Welcome to this discussion hosted by the University of California at Irvine Law School's new Fair Elections and Free Speech Center. We will be talking about the upcoming Hong Kong elections in December, and I put that in strong quotation marks. And of course, we will be discussing why that is the case in the next hour. It is notable that none of us here is in Hong Kong. That was a deliberate choice, unfortunately, because no one wants to put anyone in a difficult situation in Hong Kong these days. People have been accused of violating the national security law simply for messaging journalists. So I'll quickly introduce, first of all, we have Glacier Kwong, a Hong Kong activist in exile based in Europe, currently working on her PhD in law. She participated in the Umbrella Movement and these days works on digital rights as well as continued advocacy on Hong Kong related issues. I want to give both of you, frankly, a longer sort of self-introductions. Glacier, could you expound on that? Tell us a little bit more about what you're doing and your area of study for your PhD.
Sure. Hi, I'm Glacier Kwong. I'm born and raised in Hong Kong, and I have been active in politics since 2012. And since then, I've been an activist advocating for digital rights and democracy and freedom in Hong Kong. And I'm now pursuing a PhD in law and data protection. My research focused more on legal theories behind personal data and how does the world of commercial surveillance require us to rethink the concept of personal data and hence improve the consent model. So it's less related to politics surrounding Hong Kong, but it's like my personal interest in data protection that I am pursuing a PhD in that. And at the same time, I'm working a lot on advocacy work for Hong Kong, like raising global awareness about what's happening in Hong Kong and what's happening in the region around Hong Kong, like in China, in East Turkestan, in Tibet, and so on, and in general human rights violations committed by the Beijing regime in China. And I'm working a lot with different organizations and different projects, and I'm also conducting research on surveillance in Hong Kong right now, which are supposed to be out soon in like Q1 next year. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully it will be an interesting research. Yes, thank you very much.
And definitely follow on Twitter for those updates. Now, Jeffrey Wasserstrom is a professor at the University of California, Irvine, a historian of modern China with a particular expertise on protests and movements, although I would say he's an expert writ large on China. He is author of Vigil on contemporary Hong Kong, including the 2019 protests. Jeffrey, if you don't mind expounding a bit more about the many things and hats you wear.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So throughout much of my career, I've studied protests, and I began by studying the protests on the mainland, particularly in Shanghai in the early 20th century, and then got swept up in writing about the Tiananmen protests in 1989. And I had always been going to Hong Kong when I went to Asia, but I didn't think of it as a research place to go until I started realizing that the movements in the PRC that had the most in common with the events that I'd studied from both the early 20th century and the late 20th century were happening in Hong Kong much more than they were in the mainland by the 21st century. And so I've been fascinated by the connections as well as differences between the kinds of struggles in what I think of as the May 4th tradition writ large, struggles that are often involve youth who want to see their political community run in a better way and have more of a voice in the direction their political community is going. And I now see that very much in the story in Hong Kong from the Umbrella Movement to 2019. And I've also always studied repression and efforts to control freedom of speech. And that is now a story that's so relevant for Hong Kong. So I see it, even though I have great respect for the interest in Hong Kong activists to not have their story just subsumed into Chinese history. For me, there are lots of connections and ways in which these stories are intertwined.
Great, thank you. And we also had a panelist scheduled, Ishan Tharoor of the Washington Post and formerly in Hong Kong for a time, back in the day when we were both in Asia. He was advertised as the panelist, but is unable to attend because he is a new father. and understandably wants time off with his family. So we congratulate him, and I'm glad he is not on this panel and spending time with his new baby. By way of self-introduction, I'm Melissa Chan, a Hong Kong American journalist formerly based in China, where I covered the provinces and also as part of One Country, Two Systems, also covered Hong Kong. I continue to report on China's impact beyond its borders, although I cover other things that have nothing to do with China, since I'm based actually between Berlin and Los Angeles. Guys, we have a small panel, so this will be more of a conversation, and frankly, I think it'll be welcome. We've had a lot of panels over the last 18 months on Zoom. So please join this conversation by submitting questions, and don't wait. This is not going to be, half hour of discussion and then a half hour of questions. I'd like to start integrating them as soon as possible. Start posting your questions in the Q&A. I'll be checking this throughout, and I want to try to get through as many questions as possible. If you want to submit the questions anonymously, given the nature of the discussion, you're absolutely welcome to as well. But just to kick things off though, especially for those who might not know too much, I'm gonna go to Jeff first and ask if you can sort of start with the scene setter. Where do things stand ahead of this election in December? Maybe, I don't know if you wanna talk how much about how the voting works or whatever.
So I think one of the important things to say at the outset is Hong Kong has never had a fully democratic system. It was a colonial system in which the most powerful person was appointed by London, and there was very limited input. But over time, in the lead up to 1997, when Hong Kong was transferred from being under British control to being under Beijing's control, or part of the PRC, there were limited elections for legislature. And then after 1997, the most powerful person in the city was more appointed than really elected. There was an election, but the people running for chief executive had to be carefully vetted and selected by a very, very small group of Hong Kongers had a role in that. So one of the questions that comes up with now, Melissa said this election needs to be put in quotation marks because it's more in a sense like a selection than an election. But one could say that Hong Kong never had full elections. But what it did have, particularly during the first years after the handover and the absorption into the PRC, was it had very active campaigns in which in which candidates could vie for office, even though the deck was stacked so that there would always be, it was almost impossible for the opposition to ever have a real majority. There was always a way that there could be opposition candidates that could run for office, that could get elected to the Legislative Council, and also could run for district council elections. And one of the things that there was, even though there wasn't full democracy, there were a lot of the trappings of democracy. There were campaign speeches on the streets. You could hand out pamphlets. There was a lot of vibrant civil society debate and discussion. And that's been severely curtailed in the lead up to this. So it's not so much even how the voting has changed, but how the activities have changed, especially since 2020, when a national security law was imposed that makes it very dangerous to say even some of the kinds of things that you could say very freely before then. And you could be arrested for displaying the background that Glacier is displaying for her behind her. Just to have that slogan could be something, if you said it on the streets, could get you arrested. The other thing about the system as it was during the kind of first decades of One Country, Two System was that even though the majority of the Legislative Council might be held by elected officials who were pro-Beijing in one way or another, there could be dramatic debates within the legislature. And there could be a way in which the popular voice could lead to unwelcome legislation being blocked or tabled. There was a way in which the processes of democracy were very important. And there were some very major points in Hong Kong history since 1997 when mass demonstrations led to the government pulling back and not putting through something they had wanted to do. In 2011, 2012, there were efforts to bring a kind of mainland style patriotic education into Hong Kong. Young activists organized demonstrations against that, and that was pulled back. That was labeled, that was tabled. The government blinked. Even before that, there were efforts to bring sedition law, a new law about sedition. In 2003, there were massive demonstrations, and that was pulled back. So I think we need to see the tighter control of the election itself and as part of a tightening of controls on all sorts of forms of civil society activity, including demonstrations that were legal being made illegal. So in other words, Hong Kong was never a completely free society, was never a completely democratic society, but had much more freedom of speech, much more freedom of assembly, and much more kind of spirited campaigns than any other part of the People's Republic of China, perhaps than any other city that was under the control of a communist party, that was part of a communist party-led country. So it was really an extraordinary experiment that now Beijing has been winding down very quickly and very repressively. So that's how I would sort of paint the larger scene.
I see a question already, but let me go to Glacier and ask if you have any thoughts to what Jeff said. And also, since we don't have anyone in Hong Kong speaking out of safety reasons, whether you can give us a sense of how people really feel. I know that's really hard and nothing can be a blanket statement, but if you could give us a sense, either anecdotally or just a general feel.
In general, I actually feel very strongly about what Jeffrey said, because I grew up 1 year before, I was born 1 year before the 1997 British handover of Hong Kong to China. I actually grew up in that very vibrant civil society, and I was basically taught to say whatever I saw fit and think critically as much as I could. And I have witnessed that sort of change throughout the years, like in 2012, when the government wanted to introduce that patriotic curriculum into Hong Kong. I was like one of the students on strike outside of the government headquarters, and the civil society at the time did have impact on government policies. Like my organization and I led a campaign to defeat the Copper Amendment law at the time, and made me so hopeful that the civil society could make a change in general terms in the society. That's why I became a very active activist in the circle and so on. And in 2020, I think the election that's coming up in December comes as a really stark contrast when it compares to the primary election in 2020, where the pan-democratic camp in Hong Kong organized a primary election among themselves in July 2020 to try to maximize their chance of winning the majority in the Legislative Council of Hong Kong. And the election that was supposed to happen September 2020, so that we would have the bargaining power in the Legislative Council to threaten to ban the budget of the government, so that we can try to initiate a conversation about political reform for universal suffrage in Hong Kong. But what happened is the 47 of the candidates and organizers of the primary election are now arrested, and most of them are being put behind bars in custody for almost a year now before the trial even officially started. So it's like a very horrible situation right now. But when we compare what is happening on the streets during the primary election, I was back there campaigning very hard for the candidates that I was working for. And now in Hong Kong, basically nobody bothers what is actually happening with the election. Of course, Beijing and Hong Kong government officials are trying to present the image that everybody's very enthusiastic, that Hong Kong is finally back on track. We are guaranteed with safety and stability under national security law. But the fact is, I think I can only speak for me and my peers and the people that I know and I talk to back in Hong Kong, and most of them just really couldn't care less. They feel very upset about the fact that this is something that's happening, and they don't actually have any control over who gets elected or who gets to run in the election. Because after the reform of the electoral system, basically all candidates that are allowed to run has to be vetted beforehand by Beijing so as to become a candidate. So we actually get to vote like 20 seats out of 90 compared to 35 out of 70 in the past. But that 20 candidates that we get to vote for and elect are basically already selected by Beijing. They're handpicked. So it doesn't make any difference who we get to vote. The action of voting basically means nothing anymore in Hong Kong. And there were people like Ted Hui, a former Legislative Council member who posted on social media encouraging people to cast blank ballots, and he was today officially being a wanted criminal by the government because of advocating that. That's considered to be an act to try to subvert the state. Basically, you can't even encourage, like, tell someone to vote to cast a blank ballot in that sense. And so and it's a dilemma because you know that in Hong Kong people cannot talk about it, and as someone who is overseas, or we are overseas, we don't actually have the power or the right to tell people what to do on the ground, because that's quite irresponsible, because I am not the one who's doing that, but I'm saying you should do that. This is not something that it's very easy to say and very easy to do. And the campaigning for a blank ballot, it's basically very difficult to be very feasible, because because the result of this campaign depends a lot on the turnout rate and what is happening after the election. Like, how does the government interpret it? How does the media interpret it? So there are a lot of uncertainties there. So I'm not entirely optimistic about what will come out of this election. And I think it really depends on how foreign governments react to it. I think this is the general feeling of my colleagues and friends in Hong Kong that are all activists. We are really concerned about how foreign communities look at the election results. Will there be any action taken against this results of selection? Will there be any government issuing statements saying that this is not a genuine democratic election and there should be things done, and so on? So this is our general feeling about that.
It's really funny you said you were born 1 year before the handover. I was born many more years before that, in 1980 in Hong Kong. But just to quickly share my own experience, even in the 80s, and I split my time between the U.S. and Hong Kong at the time, but even in the 80s on Hong Kong television, the drama series. There are often, drama series related to lawyers and court proceedings. So even in the 80s and 90s, there was a strong sense of the rule of law being really important, and a lot of faith placed in the judges and the lawyers and British common law. So that's just something worth pointing out. Now, going back to everything you've been talking about with elections, I'm looking at one of the questions, an anonymous question asking that since China seems to be imposing more controls on Hong Kong, what hopes do you have for the upcoming elections? What do you hope to accomplish, or that the people of Hong Kong will accomplish? Just to get clarification from your answer, do you think a best case scenario would be then, Glacier, that people submit empty ballots, as a protest vote, or that's the best case of pushback we will see?
I think in terms of only the results of the election, the best case scenario would be a very high turnout rate and a very high rate of blank ballots. If provided that medias and the public are allowed to witness the process of counting the ballots, because there are a few voting centers that are not allowed. Medias and public attendees are not allowed, and especially those who are located at the borders of Hong Kong and those located between the borders of China and Hong Kong. Those are the places where no media and no public attendees are allowed in to witness that. But in general, if there is a high turnout rate and a very high blank ballot rate, and the media figured out to interpret this as a really strong sign of protest, and I think it does make a very strong statement to the world, because ballots or turnout rate, this is a shared language of all Western democracies. They understand this kind of election language very well. So I think that might have an impact, but I'm not sure what kind of immediate change will happen out of this blank ballot campaign. I don't see the chance of we getting democracy overnight if we have enough blank ballots. So I'm not sure. And provided how the current atmosphere is in Hong Kong, I'm not very optimistic that this will happen, because it's not like when we were back in the primary elections where millions of people would line out hours on ends just to cast a
Right.
vote in a primary election. So it would be, I'm not entirely optimistic, but I hope that that will happen as well.
Right. There's one question that says, since China is a very powerful adversary, do you think there's any possibility that the Hong Kong activists can bring about any change, or will it depend on patience and hoping that there will be movement in China to try to change the political structure in the mainland? And I want to quickly add to that, this is under the auspices of the Fair Elections and Free Speech Center, to ensure fair elections, vibrant and free debate, and the rule of law in the digital age. So that question about Hong Kong activists being able to bring about change, or whether they will have to depend on change on the mainland, is a question for both of you. But if possible, if you can also put it in the context of the digital age and whether there's any relevancy to that. Jeff?
Sure. So, I mean, I think as a historian, there are both reasons to be despairing about what's going on in Hong Kong and also cautiously hopeful, at least if you take a very long-term view. At the moment, it seems that the movement faces seemingly impossible odds. But we can think about lots of other settings in which people face seemingly impossible odds, and eventually there was change. It often requires changes in more than one place, but kind of patience and making whatever use of space you have is crucial. So like one historical scenario that a lot of people in Hong Kong, activists at least, are thinking a lot about Václav Havel. So they think about a time at the end of Prague Spring in 1968, when tanks had rolled in and when a movement had been completely suppressed. It was then a very dark period for about 20 years, which is a very long time, but people made use of whatever spaces they could. I think Václav Havel, with the power of the powerless, would understand very much casting a blank ballot. When you can't have any choices, you show through a symbolic act that you're resisting the lack of choices. So you could look at a place like the former Soviet bloc, and you think about it, it took a lot of time and a lot of patience, and it also required a change in the capital that had the most control. It required, in part, Gorbachev, a kind of figure that nobody saw coming, to open up new kinds of spaces. So you do need to, there's a very kind of long game in which there can be the possibility for this. And I think it's often something that people keep struggles alive. There were long periods when anti-colonial movements seemed there was no way they were going to succeed, and eventually sometimes they did, and required many things to line up to do that. I mean, I think with the digital age, things are different, in part because it allows more of a connection between what's going on outside of a place and inside of a place, with the circulation of ideas through online media. But I think in the past, even there are parallels to that. I mean, there were ways in which exile communities, diasporas helped keep movements alive in many different cases, including cases in China. You know, Sun Yat-sen spent time in London when he was not that different in age than somebody like Nathan Law is spending time in London. It's not that there are direct parallels, but the fact of keeping alive a movement in exile is something that we've seen in many other kinds of settings, anti-colonial settings. I think in many ways, the Hong Kong struggle now can be seen as having a lot of parallels to anti-colonial struggles. I mean, there are much darker scenarios too. It's not that things necessarily do end up succeeding. I mean, I'm fascinated now by the question of how people keep hope alive. Some people do through religious faith. There are some Hong Kong activists who are deeply religious and have a belief in a kind of the arc of the universe bending toward justice. Is another deeply religious activist, Martin Luther King, thought of it. But there are other people who say, well, you can also look at places in which repressive regimes can go on for very long times. So I think you need to balance these kinds of things. But clearly, being patient, making use of whatever spaces do exist, either in Hong Kong itself, internationally, online, in print, is just a way of biding time. I mean, I think the other place to look at, and you can see this as hopeful or you can see this as distressing, would be to look at a place nearby, Taiwan, which was under martial law for decades after a big protest in 1947 that was brutally suppressed. There you have you had the Nationalist Party rather than the Communist Party, but an authoritarian state keeping tight controls for a very long time, but activists within Taiwan and in exile tried to keep kind of hope alive in differing ways. And after a very, very long time, partly because of changes in the wider world, partly because of uses to build up civil society, even in a very difficult setting, there was eventually change. So there are reasons to, I think, being very despairing in the short run, but also at least kind of thinking, not foreclosing the possibilities for hope, even in a seemingly hopeless situation.
Glacier, your thoughts on possibilities in the digital age?
Yes, and like in response to the question of hope, as an activist, I'm not a hopeful one. I just have a very naive and very firm belief that what I'm doing is right, no matter the results, no matter if Hong Kong is going to really have democracy and freedom in the future, because I don't have a crystal ball. I don't do fortune telling as well, so I don't know for sure, but I just have that very strong belief that what I'm doing is right. It's basic fundamental human rights that we all should have, and this is why I'm doing it. And there is a slogan, I think not happening in the 2019 movement, but way before. It says, it's not that we have hope, that's why we persist. It's more like the other way around. It's more like, because you persist, therefore you see hope. And I feel like if you ask me about hope, then this is the answer I will give. Like, I don't feel very hopeful in general, but I am an activist and it's my obligation to facilitate meaningful changes. As Jeffrey said, like, as much as we can make use of the space that we have right now, being we are outside or inside of Hong Kong, we have to exhaust all means, because even in the 2019 movement, we're basically at a stage of try and error. We figured out 3 ways that seem to be working at the time. That is protests on the streets, like international advocacy, and the electoral approach. That was the primary election that I spoke of. And then these are the things that worked at the time. And then the government found out new ways to crack down on us, that is national security law, and make all of these 3 things kind of impossible on the ground. So we are back to square one. We are again trying to make sure there are things that are working. It doesn't have to be very visible political actions, but for example, community building, trying to make sure that filmmakers still have the space to make films. Like, there are artists and filmmakers in Hong Kong who are still trying to do their jobs at filmmaker, even though a lot of documentaries, a lot of films about Hong Kong are being banned from screening, but they're still trying to find a way to do it. Or there are artists writing songs indirectly about people leaving Hong Kong and fleeing the city. That became a huge hit in Hong Kong. And there are a lot of things happening, and as well as in the diaspora community. For example, Nathan Law this week just founded a new organization that is trying to preserve the culture of Hong Kong. And there are a lot of Hong Kong actors working like on different issues, like advocacy. For myself, is more about digital rights and the use of technology in general, which brings us back to the possibility when it comes to like digital space. I think it's very amazing to see how the digital space play a role in the movement in 2019 as well as now, because when we look at activism and campaigning in general, it's happening a lot online now. For example, a few weeks ago, the hashtag "Where is Pang Shui" has been trending on Twitter, and it has successfully put immense pressure on officials and sports association, on athletes, regarding the upcoming Winter Olympic Games that is happening in Beijing. And the campaign has never gained so much momentum before the hashtag "Where is Pang Shui." And Pang Shui basically posted a Me Too statement on China's social media site. I think it's Weibo. And that post got deleted right away in a few minutes. But some Chinese netizens have captured the post and then share it outside the Great Firewall, and it gained momentum very quickly outside of China, which caused a lot of trouble for the Chinese government in general, and they're trying their very best to cover the whole story up. And I think another example during the movement is the hashtag Stand with Hong Kong or Milk Tea Alliance in general. These are what happened during the movement for in Hong Kong, and these are the tactics that we use to try to address the narrative that Beijing wanted to put out. That is, we are ungrateful brats and we are the rioters that cannot afford a flat. That's why we are taking it to the state. In general, this is how Beijing wanted to portray us into. But with the aid of the internet, with the aid of social media and some tactics of campaigning, we're able to kind of send our own narrative, our own story out. And of course, as activists abroad, this is my job as well. I'm here not to tell my story, but to tell you what is happening to Hong Kong in general, what is Hong Kong, what is happening to Hong Kong, how are Hong Kongers feeling. Of course, I can't represent everyone, but this is more or less my job as a Hong Kong activist right now, to be able to deliver that and add some of a personal touch to it so that it feels more relatable. And I think the digital world in general provide me with a platform to do that. Without the internet, without social media, without Zoom in general, I won't be able to be here talking to all of you. So that's how it's been made possible.
I just have a quick follow-up. Oh, yes, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's really it's inspiring to be on a panel with somebody so passionate and so articulate about these issues. And I just your response to the whole issue of hope, I think, is really powerful. I'm part of a group at UCI, the Forum for the Academy and the Public, which we held an event a few years ago about climate change. And one of the participants said that the issue isn't about hope, it's about courage. That you have to have, sometimes you're dealing with these struggles where it's the wrong way to try to figure out, to try to guess what the future is, but it's just what you need to do and what you feel is important to do. And I think it's really impressive what people are doing within Hong Kong itself. You mentioned the artists. I would also mention some of the journalists who are making the most of this space that's very difficult to carve out, but they're figuring out other things to write about that aren't directly, that don't directly trigger responses, but still are encouraging making use of whatever there is there. About the digital, because I kind of avoided that, I think one of the great ironies of history is that every new technology of communication, it seems, gives new weapons to the powerless and also gives new weapons to the powerful. And you have this kind of continual thing. We've seen this back as far as the printing press, but clearly, especially with the kind of digital mode, that there are new forms of technology that increase the ability of surveillance, that give repressive states new kinds of power. But at the same time, they give activists new kinds of leverage. It also allows tactics and slogans. Glacier mentioned the Milk Tea Alliance, but there are ways in which protesters in different parts of the world can be exposed to the ideas and the slogans and the symbols of one another in ways that encourage solidarity and also give them new tactics to include in their repertoire. And one of the amazing things about the 2019 protests in Hong Kong was that even when they were suppressed, they gave models to people in other parts of the world that were drawn upon in very creative ways, from Burma to Thailand to Belarus. There were ways in which the Be Water approach, the Mockingjay salute that came originally from fantasy fiction and then came onto the streets in different places. Songs got picked up different places, and Hong Kong itself was borrowing, Hong Kongers were borrowing very creatively, as befits a cosmopolitan global city, from things that were going on in many different parts of the world, and were localizing tactics from other places, the Hong Kong way, the hand-holding protest that was borrowed from decades before in the Baltic states, songs that were borrowed from everything from Broadway musicals to other songs were adapted, localized, and then also then sent back out into the world. But at the same time, these new technologies, we have to guard against a kind of techno-utopianism that imagines that once there's the internet, somehow there'll be no stopping struggles for change. We know very well, we've learned very hard lessons about this, that the same new technologies that can spread exciting new ideas can spread misinformation, disinformation, and the tools of surveillance in the hands of the state, as we see in places like Xinjiang, can be incredibly powerful and incredibly distressing.
I think
Yeah,
adding to that, when it comes to like, I'm sorry, when it
Go
comes
ahead.
to like the technology being used by the government, I think this is a dilemma because in digital security trainings, we say the safest way is not to use anything, which is impossible in this day and age. And the more we rely on the internet and social media or different digital tools for protesting, for activism, and for campaigning, the more digital footprints that we're leaving. And the government would have access to these things no matter what service we're using. Especially when it comes to like big tech companies like Facebook, Google, or Apple, and so on, because they hold so much data. And even though some of them actually promised that they will never turn over data to the Hong Kong government after the national security law had passed, Google was recently found that they did comply to several data requests that are made by the Hong Kong government. And this is very scary because I think Google knows more about me than my parents or any person in my life. They basically recorded my whole online activity and online life. This is my perception of big tech companies. And so this is clearly a dilemma that we're facing. And it's very true that we need more help in terms of how do we protect ourselves against surveillance technology, because it has happened in Hong Kong. We have something like a corona tracing app in Hong Kong, but it is not as reliable as the ones that are abroad. Even the ones abroad are not entirely reliable, to be very honest. And the one is in Hong Kong, it's quite problematic because the government has refused to open the source code and nobody is able to actually check if there are backdoors, if where are the data being transferred to, and so on. The government is now trying to implement it in government buildings. If you don't have that app, if you don't use that app, there is no other way that you can enter the building. And it creates a lot of real life problem because they're elderly, so don't own a smartphone. There are people who are, for example, if you want to attend your friends or your colleagues' trial in court because they're accused of maybe rioting or under national security law, you basically have to use that app to access the courtroom. And that makes it a real name policy for you to go into the courtroom. So the government can easily like map the whole network of those defendants in the courtroom and so on. Like there are a lot of these implications. So there is this problem of new technology at one point, like empowering us, at the same time, it provide more means of crackdown for the government as well.
And I see a question that kind of, I'm jumping around, I'm trying to create some narrative, so we're not totally hopping around, but what Jeff was talking about in terms of Belarus or even, the United States during a lot of protests, I know some protesters were looking at how Hong Kong protesters were protecting themselves from gas. And this question is, what lessons is Hong Kong learning from the Arab Spring? So it's the other way around, right? Protesters can learn from each other transnationally, but so can states, authoritarian states. And so do we see something like, and this goes back to the perpetual question long-term, whether Hong Kong is really going to go the route of the Arab Spring, where suppression has worked. And I want to also piggyback another question that I see on here, which I think is related, talking about the national security law and the environment in Hong Kong, and talking about the future of Hong Kong and the next generation of Hong Kongers growing up not knowing democracy or those ideas, being taught patriotic education. I think those two go hand in hand, right? Glacier, you talked about being of the generation where you were taught to think freely, but they are adamant on creating a generation. So in 20, 30 years, maybe young Hong Kongers will say things that frankly will break your heart. So, I mean, right? I mean, so Glacier or Jeff, I don't know which part of that you just want to address, but the Arab Spring question, going the way of Arab Spring, and also the next generation, frankly, being more inclined and okay with authoritarianism.
Well, I'll jump in on the Arab Spring one. You know, it seems a historian's question. So I think there are fascinating examples. I mean, I think one of the things that's clear is that activists need to do as much as they can to learn from each other because authoritarians are studying each other very, very well. William Dobson has a wonderful book that was inspired partly by Arab Spring called The Dictator's Learning Curve, where he was talking about how how right and left wing authoritarian states were kind of modeling worse practices on each other. That, you know, Putin's Russia was looking at China, drawing lessons about how to control. But he was also talking about how activists were traveling around. In that case, partly activists from the former Yugoslavia that were giving lessons to other activists. So I think with the Arab Spring, there are multiple things. One is the kind of what I think of as the different movements against what was seen as a common kind of enemy, borrowing techniques from each other and learning from each other is something that we see going on to some extent with the Milk Tea Alliance now. And we can think about that. This is also something, though, it's you know, these aren't brand new. I'm reading a fascinating book right now, Friends of Freedom, which is the rise of social movements in the time of the late 18th century. And it talks about how with the Atlantic revolutions, it's sometimes forgotten how much people were watching each other and trying to figure out what was working in Paris, what was working in the colonies in the US, what would be the US, what was working in Haiti, and how much mutual influence there was between those. And in the early 20th century, while that book, Friends of Freedom by Micah Alpa is one I'm just reading, one of the best books I've read in years is one by Tim Harper called Underground Asia, which is about activists in the early 20th century in separate kinds of movements against different colonial authorities or different authoritarian authorities were coming across each other in the port cities of Asia or in places like Paris, forming anti-colonial leagues. How much people in different kinds of controlled settings were looking for things they could learn from each other. And I think that's fascinating. You know, 100 years ago, ironically, the people who would form the Chinese Communist Party were part of that learning from each other activists in exile group. And now they're one of the large authoritarians. Their inheritors in the Chinese Communist Party are one of the states that are now learning the lessons of the autocrats and trying to control people that are rising up against a Beijing that now seems very much like those kinds of colonial authorities that the Chinese Communist Party and groups like that, the Vietnamese Communist Party, were formed in order to resist. So history is just endlessly fascinating, the parallels you can see, but also I think in many cases, the ironies of this.
I am not very familiar with history, especially with your Arab Spring, so I'm just gonna leave it there. But I'm sorry, I'm not a history major in general. About the education system, I think it's been there for a long time. For example, the secondary school that I went to, the year after me, they already have to study Mandarin and Chinese classes. I'm very, very lucky to be the last batch of students in my school that are still using Cantonese for Chinese lesson. And the year is after me, they're all using Mandarin for a bit of time until they decided to stop and switch back to Cantonese again. And so the language, it's like trying to make us less familiar with our own language is already happening for a long, long time. I think it was around 10 years ago. Oh, I kind of feel quite old now. I can say it's 10 years ago now. And so this is actually happening. And because I belong to the batch who also have to study like liberal studies in secondary school. And this is the reason the subject of liberal studies is perceived by the government as the cause of our generation being super annoying, that we're taught to think critically. We're taught to criticize the government policies, and in general, this is what made us troublesome in the government's mind. But in my opinion, I don't think it's only that. Of course, it's played a role into pushing us to, for the sake of exam, we learn how to criticize the government, and that became, we are basically trained for exams, so really good at criticizing the government as a result of studying liberal studies in high school. But I think in general is the environments that we grew up in. I grew up seeing like Jimmy Lai founded the Apple Daily, using the front page to criticize the government, or people going to the 2003 1st of July march protesting against the Article 23, which was and somewhat a different version of the national security law that was supposed to be implemented in 2003. And I witnessed June 4th vigils being held every year until 2020. And so our generation grew up in this setting that a lot of things are allowed, like criticism allowed, dissent are allowed, and so on. But I believe the generations that are in Hong Kong right now, the younger generations, they will not be able to have that, especially those who are a lot younger than I am. Like a lot of youngsters, like teenagers, were part of the movement in 2019. So they still had that experience, that traumatic experience of having to fight for freedom. But the generations after that, they would be definitely brainwashed if nothing is to be done right now. And they will, as Melissa put it, like say things that will definitely break my heart. And this is something that I don't want to see, but that's why a lot of parents of young children are moving out of Hong Kong, because they don't want that for their kids. And in general, in schools, they're now, no matter how old you're basically being fed with patriotic ideas. Your school have to raise a national flag, have to sing the national anthem, and you will be taught that the Communist Party in Beijing is a progressive one, is an open and successful leader of the country that lifts the whole country out of poverty, and so on. A lot of these different things. Even in universities, if you want to graduate from certain universities, you will have to take national security law classes, and in the classroom there are cameras surveilling the whole class that's going on. And this is simply a blatant threat to academic freedom and the freedom of expression in Hong Kong. And so I would not be surprised if in a few decades, like the younger generation would say something that I was like completely like shocked and in disbelief. But I don't hope that the situation will worsen up till then. That is why a lot of people are trying to make sure, like as journalists, they're still trying to report what's happening. They're trying to navigate around that space, that they're still able to do the job, so that at least some sort of information can be there and people can read about that.
There's actually, Glacier, a personal question in Q&A that we haven't been able to get to. This person says, and he or she or they is anonymous, I remember you spoke about getting harassing text messages asking you to stop what you are doing, or else you will never be able to go back to Hong Kong. Has that still been happening? And I guess I ask it now, especially since we're talking about surveillance of classrooms and things like that. I don't know how much you're willing to share about your own personal experiences, but certainly to make it very real for the people listening.
The threats that I got telling me to stop what I was doing, or else I wouldn't be able to go back to Hong Kong, happened when I was working on a petition in the German parliament urging for sanctions against Chinese officials that violated human rights. And that wasn't a very pleasant experience, but it's not the only time that I got threats, but the threats come in many different shapes. Like there are obviously phishing attempts, trying to pretend to be my colleagues or pretend to be someone that I work with and I trust, and try to like lure me into clicking and to downloading malware to my computer and my devices. There are people who, because I was doxxed by the pro-establishment camps in Hong Kong, so basically my phone numbers and everything was up on the internet, and I would get calls like I think they try to call me AM time in Hong Kong, but because I'm in Europe, so it's like basically my nighttime, and it will be sometimes it's silent call, sometimes it will be someone shouting at you. And there are other forms, like I get unsolicited dick pics on my Twitter DMs from time to time. Like that is the worst part of the whole thing. But it's not like it's not because I'm a female. In general, I have male colleagues who also receive unsolicited nudes in general. So I think this is just a trend. Like there are a lot of different things, and of course, like I have been suspectedly followed on the streets, and this is also happening to a lot of other activists
On the streets in Germany, you mean? Or
yes, and because I'm based in Hamburg, and before the first lockdown in Hamburg, I was seeing the same person around the neighborhood, and I thought, oh, it must be a neighbor for the first 2 days. But then on the third day, I went out to the city center of Hamburg to grab a coffee with a friend, but I still saw the same person. And then I was a bit terrified, but then the lockdown happened, so there was not much to follow it around. And then since then, I've never been into another episode of these things, but it makes you quite paranoid thinking about the idea that there might be someone following you.
I mean, just to add to that, as someone who's also been followed like that in China, though, if you notice the same person, I know there might be people who think we're all paranoid or doubting the story. If you see the same person over and over, we're not 007, we're not James Bond. Like if you see the same person, it's because they want you to know that you're being followed. It's deliberate and it's an intimidation tactic. But you did mention just now that you were involved in a petition in Germany. So this is a question for both of you, and it's from an anonymous attendee, whether there are certain expectations of the international community, the EU, the US, to what extent could the new federal government in Germany influence developments in Hong Kong? So Jeff, we'll go to you, definitely. We've been on Glacier for a while, but Glacier, since you did mention the petition, where do things stand with that? And quickly, your thoughts on the new German government and what they might do.
I think in general, the general expectations of the Western international community, like the US and the EU, is to have a stronger stance against China. Don't tolerate human rights abuses, and don't let China bundle don't let China separate the issues of human rights and trade. If China managed to say we're talking about human rights, then we're not talking altogether, then basically the Western world should be able to say if we're not talking about human rights, we're not talking either. Like this is a two-way thing, and trade doesn't happen when only I need you. Like basically you need the Chinese market, but Chinese market also needs your services and products in general. So this is it shouldn't be like a bully game. Like we shouldn't be bullied by China in general. And I think like in terms of short-term goal, I really hope that more countries will join the UK and the US into at least diplomatically boycotting the Winter Olympic Games, hold the Chinese government accountable for what they're doing in the East Turkestan region that is putting millions of Uyghurs into re-education camps and destroying Hong Kong's civil society. I think these things, there are clear international law standards that should be followed and action should be taken. And in terms of the new federal government in Germany, if you look closely to the foreign policies, I think in comparison to the age where Merkel was still in charge, there are definitely visible improvements. But as someone who cannot return to Hong Kong, I say that's definitely not enough for my taste. Like I am kind of more or less a bit disappointed to how polite or how nice Germany still are. They are still trying to a certain extent, extend what Merkel did in the past. Of course, they're a bit strong. They have like more explicit statements saying that one country, two system must be restored in Hong Kong, and they don't want to change the status quo when it comes to Taiwan and so on. This is like a very progressive act, but it's not enough. Like Germany has been criticized for so long for its indirect involvement in human rights violations in China. For example, Volkswagen still has its own factory in Xinjiang, which is more or less a bit shady because there are a lot of forced labor involved in that region. And there should be things that could be done about it. For example, like implementing regulations and laws that requires companies to do the due diligence before they can set up a factory or do this kind of investment abroad. And there are ways to ensure a humane production chain in general. And a more like taking the lead in the EU to implement more Magnitsky sanctions and make sure that the EU is going into the right direction of less dependent on the Chinese market and try to deepen cooperation with other democratic countries. I think these are all things that they should do, and I see the trend of them doing it, and I hope that it will continue and they will move a bit faster than the past.
Jeff, over to you about the international community.
So I think one of the biggest things that, well, I get distressed about the international community just sort of losing interest. I think there's just a key part is to stay concerned and to think about connections between what's going on at different edges of the PRC. And so I think to be talking about the plight of Uyghurs at the same time you're talking about what's going on in Hong Kong and not forgetting about Tibet and other places, and also about there's an overarching story that's a very worrisome one about what's going on under Xi Jinping in China, but it began before Xi Jinping, which is less and less toleration for any forms of difference across the PRC, less toleration for forms of religious difference, for linguistic difference, for ethnic difference. And I think it can be hard for the international community to understand these connections between those. So I think the more we see these as linked to each other, the more value it is. And just to sort of keep attention that things like Hong Kong, the attacks on civil society really matter as an ongoing thing, a harbinger of things to come in other kinds of settings. So I think that's one thing that the international community can do. I mean, I feel more comfortable talking about what scholars can do to sort of keep attention on these things, and also to push back against the efforts by Beijing to try to own the idea of Chinese culture and to try to have the idea that there's only one appropriate way to be Chinese or what Chineseness means. And I think we can push back against that in many ways. I find very inspiring what Gregory B. Lee is doing at St. Andrews University now, where there's a Chinese studies program where you're encouraged, where graduate students have to learn a second Chinese language. There's no assumption that Mandarin is the Chinese language. And you can specialize in Pearl River cultures. I think the more that we kind of try to disaggregate China and to realize that the imposition of a single form of Chineseness is something artificial that's being placed on it, that in some ways is, and we should be as skeptical of it and as pushing back against that as people of Jewish descent are about Israel, the Israeli government through a version of Zionism trying to control what it means to be Jewish. We have a language to talk about how you can say that I'm somebody of Jewish descent who is a fierce critic of Zionism. We have a difficulty finding the language to do that, but I think it's just as clear that you should be able to say that you are of Chinese descent or you have great respect for Chinese culture, but you don't accept the version of it that's coming out of Beijing in its rhetoric and in its policies.
Oh, I think I would want to add to that as well. I think another thing the Western world should do in general is don't get fooled by the Chinese government, especially the narrative that the Beijing government puts out there. When they talk about market, when they talk about multilateral relationships, they don't mean the same thing as they mean in the Western context. The market in China is not actually the free market or the invisible hand as we know it. That's basically a tool for the Beijing government to allocate resources instead of for actually free transactions of goods and so on. And it also happens to multilateral relationship. It means different countries' relationship to China instead of like the set of dynamics between different countries in general. And so I think this is something that we really have to learn to not get fooled by them.
Great. I think that's a great way to end from both of you. So Jeff Glacier, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in.